Okay, so it's gonna be interesting if you're into this sort of thing. And you have any thoughts on it, let me know. So here's one of the reasons I like Dr. Heiser. I'll just tell you, having someone who is respectable outside of my own tradition that will defend this in the as a mainstream idea is nice to have someone. It makes you feel good or comfortable that other people will. Because I mean, this sort of thing would be, well, let's just say people who deny, if this the majority view on Ezekiel 28 in scholarship would essentially, it would deny the way I see the biblical worldview. So if this was false, so it's nice to have somebody defending it or whatever that's outside your tradition. This idea, um, but I mean, push comes to shove. If he didn't believe it, I would still believe it, I suppose, because it's really regarding there being a divine rebellion. I think that's instrumental to the biblical narrative. Is making sense of the theodicy for me, seeing it this way. So let me play this. So what this is going to be, I have a suggestion. Dr. Heiser shifted his view a little bit. Of course, he wasn't insisting on anything. It had to be understood a certain way, and he offered different interpretations and the data for those interpretations and why he believes what he believes. And he mentions his shift from earlier things he published on his blog. And I just was listening and thought, informed by my own reading of scripture and my tradition, I'm going to make a slight suggestion of a modification. It would be interesting. That would have been interesting to talk to him about. This is regarding the stones of fire. I'm not even sure what my tradition says the stones of fire are, other than that they would want to emphasize that the description seems to, if I recall in my tradition, or the way I remember understanding it at least, maybe they didn't really say this, but someone can leave in the comments if they can remind me or whatever, any sort of reference. But you were, clearly we said he's obviously falling prior to, or, in Eden or before Eden, Satan. Heiser says it's a divine rebellion, a primordial fall of a divine being. And so let me start playing that, but we're also going to look at how he argues for Isaiah 14, informing Ezekiel 28, which most scholars refuse to do because they don't want to interpret the Bible through a sort of comprehensive. I've seen there's so much written about what is influencing the language in Ezekiel 28 that has classically, from a conservative point of view, understood that to be speaking of the fall of Satan. And then, of course, Isaiah 14 ties to that, and that's Heiser takes that view. Now, I'll let him comment about it, but it's like scholarship will look high and low to try to come up with some theory of the ancient Near East informing Ezekiel 28, but it clearly, everybody realizes there's similar language in Isaiah 14. So, but of course, scholarship would have to be almost believe scripture or had an actual narrative to tell, so that's off limits. So there's just so much stuff offered, people offering all sorts of crazy ideas when it's sitting right in front of them. But even some conservative scholars will deny that Ezekiel 28 is talking about anything more than the Prince of Tyre, but maybe giving a sort of, many people want to say, well, it's talking about Adam. Adam was the one in Eden. A lot of conservatives with believers even will want to take that view because the Bible doesn't really talk about a divine rebellion per se, but that doesn't make sense. And Heiser brings that out. Doesn't fit with Adam being the one behind Tyre. And is one other thing that's makes sense with what Heiser has brought to light or pointed out is a good scholar that's a believer but doesn't just believe whatever he wants, pays attention to the scholarship. And that would be that something that I've always kind of thought, which really is intriguing. It's very intriguing about this kind of narrative running through the Bible, particularly in the book of Daniel, and a careful reading of some of the language regarding the divine council. And that is, and in the New Testament regarding the defeat of supernatural beings. That's certainly it's Satan, but more than that. Of course, Heiser's work on Deuteronomy 32, his better reading of Jesus' use of Psalm 82 in the book of John, which I agree with, which I wasn't taught, but it makes sense to me. When Paul talks about principalities and powers behind the nations and how that runs through, a careful look at sort of this thing, Revelation 12, right? Daniel 8 through 10 in particular, the data given there. And then the way Paul speaks of, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. There's something going on here that a lot of believing Christianity has missed, and it's clearly legitimate and part of the actual context of the New Testament that a lot of people miss or want to deny. So let's explore that, and I'll give you some of my thoughts and insights on what I see going on in Enoch, where I take a similar view of Heiser with Enoch. I would take a little harder view, saying, it seems to me anyways, that while Enoch has value, I do not think it should inform our interpretation of the Bible. He might think that more than I do. But I'll offer what I think is going on, because I take a sort of 200-ish BC dating of first Enoch anyway. And so it is produced not by Enoch, so it should not be part of the canon. It's not authentic, but it gives a lot of insights in the thinking of that time period, which helps inform us. And we see its influence in at least the structure of, like, even the book of Revelation. But I do not believe it makes it something to completely inform our views of what the Bible is saying. So I take a stronger view of the 66 Protestant canon as being the informative, infallible books which are meant by God for us to inform us on our beliefs. So Enoch can only inform us as like a secondary source and should not lead our interpretation, but can help guide us in the thinking and give insights into the way they were using Daniel and the Old Testament prophets. And then it maybe help inform the sort of symbolism that will help connect the New Testament, like in the book of Revelation, and the theology going on in the New Testament with Paul and Jesus, of course, and how to connect the two more accurately in the way the New Testament apocalypse should help inform us of what's going on in the Old Testament, and perhaps even help us figure out exactly the right sense of how to understand the millennium period, if it's legitimate at all, or let's say the judgment, or the end of the world, or final events. All right, let me play it.
The phrase stones of fire, for those who are wondering what in the world is this about, really comes from Ezekiel 28, specifically Ezekiel 28:14 and Ezekiel 28:16. So I'm just going to read 14 through 16 so that we get the flavor of what the passage says. So we read in Ezekiel 28, beginning in verse 14, it says, "You were an anointed guardian cherub." I'm reading from the ESV, by the way. "I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire, you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, till unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God. And I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire." Now, this is a familiar passage to people who have read Unseen Realm. Ezekiel 28, just generally speaking, is not about, again, specifically the episode in Eden, but there's a lot of that Edenic flavoring in it. Specifically, what it's about, it's a lament directed toward the Prince of Tyre, and the issue is with this with scholars, and again, just a correct, accurate reading of it is that the prophet Ezekiel is using some sort of backstory about a primeval rebellion as material to cast the Prince of Tyre in a certain way, to talk about the Prince of Tyre's hubris and his pride and his arrogance in a certain way. Now, I take the minority view here, and readers of Unseen Realm know this. I take the minority view that the backstory is about a divine rebel. The majority position, both in terms of evangelical scholars and secular scholars, if we can use that term, is that the backstory is the primeval rebellion of a human, namely Adam. So I don't take the Adam view; I take the divine rebel view. So now, in the normal, again, in the normative majority view, again, evangelical and otherwise, the idea goes like this: the cherub that's mentioned in Ezekiel 28 there is with Adam, or in some cases, that language will be attributed to Adam. The place that the backstory occurs in is Eden. We get that from Ezekiel 28:13, again, which actually references the Garden of God, Eden, the Garden of God in verse 13. Also, this cosmic mountain language that we read in those verses 14 through 16, that takes us back to Eden because, again, as readers of Unseen Realm know, the cosmic mountain idea refers to the abode of God, the place from which God runs his affairs, the place where the divine council meets, his throne room, so to speak. And all of that, again, fits very nicely in biblical theology with Eden. Thirdly, the majority of you would say there's no divine rebel figure in view in Ezekiel 28 at all. Okay, that's just a phantom character. Again, he's not there at all. It's just about Adam. And fourthly, Ezekiel 28, since it is a lament over the king of Tyre for his unrighteous pride, they believe, again, the majority believes that the analogy being struck is comparing the king of Tyre's pride with the pride, the hubris of Adam. Now, right away, again, I'm sure there's listeners thinking out there, well, the Genesis 3 story never really casts Adam that way. And frankly, no other passage casts Adam that way. And that's true. But I think that's only one of the disconnects that leads me to take, again, the minority view, the view I do hold. And that is, again, that we're talking about a backstory that involves a divine rebel, not a human rebel, not Adam. So in my view, the picture is different. Of course, the passage is a lament over the king of Tyre. I acknowledge that. I have no problem with that. The backstory, the analogy in play, is not what happened with Adam. It's not about Adam, but rather the backstory is a tale of divine rebellion, a specific divine being who, through his hubris, his arrogance, his pride, rebels against the authority of God. Therefore, when I look at the passage, the cherub here is not with Adam. Adam is not with the cherub. The cherub is this divine being, and Adam is not present. Okay, so the first view, the majority view, says, hey, this divine rebel, this divine being, a divine being in the garden here, that's just a vapor, that's just a phantom. I say the opposite. I say that Adam is not in view in the passage at all. And then lastly, again, the backstory would be about the hubris of a divine being in Eden, the place of the divine council, the cosmic mountain. And again, I think that we do get the figure, the Nakash in Genesis 3, but that figure, as that figure is talked about later, specifically when you get in between the Testaments and when you get on to the New Testament, that figure is talked about in terms of pride and arrogance and whatnot. There's more of a rebellious figure, a rebellious feeling to it than you have, if it's just, the Adam story. I'm not saying that Adam didn't rebel. I mean, he did. There's a transgression there. There's sin. But the feeling I don't get from it is this hubris, this act of, I'm just so much of this or that I'm going to go off in my own way. I don't think the passage reads that way. Now, to get more technical, and if people want the details on this, you're not going to find them specifically in Unseen Realm, but you can find them on the companion website, moreunseenrealm.com. And if you go up to the chapters, I think it's like 11 or 12 that deal with this subject on the website, you're going to get more detail. Now, the majority view follows the Septuagint. The Septuagint, instead of in verse 14, us reading, "You were an anointed guardian cherub," the Septuagint actually reads, "I placed you with the cherub in the holy mountain of God." So that creates, again, the flavor, the feeling that, okay, there's this cherub here, there's this divine being here, but there's somebody with him. And then that somebody becomes Adam. Now, I don't follow the Septuagint in this regard. I follow the Masoretic text. And you say, well, why don't people follow the traditional Hebrew text here? It's because there are some really odd grammatical and morphological forms in the Masoretic text in this chapter that many scholars have said, well, they just don't make sense. We don't know what to do with them. We either need to change them or go with the Septuagint. And frankly, they opt for both of those, that the Septuagint is the better texture, so that's what we're going to read. Now, there are a lot of scholars, a substantial number of scholars that think that's just a big mistake. The Masoretic text does not need to be changed here, does not need to be amended. The Hebrew forms are rare, but they are understandable. Now, if you go to the moreunseenrealm.com site, I'm going to reference a specific article in this regard by James Barr, who's a very famous Old Testament scholar. Barr mounts a really serious defense and a coherent defense of the Masoretic text, reading in this passage, and I think he's right. And if you go with the Masoretic text, you've only really got one option. Adam is not there. Okay, which means you have to go with a divine rebel. And again, that's the view I take. Now, you look at some of this and you go, well, what does this have to do with the topic? Well, the stones of fire either describes the place of the divine council, that it has something to do with the description of the cosmic mountain, or it describes the members of the divine council. Again, the stones of fire would be divine beings. So it's either has to do with the place or the members of the council. Now, again, I think that it makes a lot more sense in the direction I'm going to go. I'm going to give you, material for both here, but the direction I'm going to go is that stones of fire are the members of the divine council. And I think it actually makes more sense in the broader scope of things. Now, if you think about what I wrote in Unseen Realm about the Nakash, about Eden and all that stuff, one of my major arguments, and again, another one of the major reasons I take the minority view here, I go with the Masoretic text and I see a divine rebel, is because every Old Testament scholar, regardless of what they do with Ezekiel 28, every one of them will say there is a very close relationship between Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14. And if you look at Isaiah 14, look at the language you get. You get a reference to this rebel figure, the rebel figure of Isaiah 14, wanting to be above the stars of El, the stars of God, getting exposed, quote unquote, before kings and getting sent down to Sheol and all this sort of stuff. Now, I would suggest to you that none of that language applies to Adam as we get the story in Genesis 3. But it does apply to a divine rebel. And so my big question for my opponents here is, why is it that if you recognize a close relationship between Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, why don't you be consistent with that relationship and let Isaiah 14 influence or help you read Ezekiel 28? In other words, what you say about Ezekiel 28, who the rebel is there, who the major character of the backstory is there. Whatever you say about Ezekiel 28, you ought to be consistent and say, well, I need to be able to say that about Isaiah 14. And that's what many scholars refuse to do. They refuse to be consistent on the way they read both passages, keeping them together in this tight relationship that they all say is there. But then somehow they just split them apart when it comes to this issue. Again, it's very inconsistent. So again, I'm gonna hold my ground here and say this is a divine rebel in Ezekiel 28. And now let's go back to the verses and think about the stones of fire. I've already prepped you by saying you can go one of two directions here. You can either say it's the place or the members, and I think the members makes more sense. And if we read it as though there's a divine rebel story here, the Nakash idea, I think that's actually going to make the second option as far as what the stones of fire are a little clearer. So let's go back to Ezekiel 28. I'm just going to read it again. You were an anointed guardian cherub. Okay, you're divine. You're a divine being. You're an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. I set you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. This is where I put you. In the midst of the stones of fire, you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God. I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Now let's add a verse 17. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I exposed you before kings to feast their eyes on you. Again, none of that is true of Adam. It just doesn't make, again, much sense. So what about the stones of fire? A lot of people are influenced in their reading of this by one passage in 1st Enoch that I'm gonna read here. And I think you'll see that there is certainly some relationship here. But when I read this from Enoch, what you're also going to hear is that both options for the stones of fire, either the place or the beings who are present, they're actually both in this passage too. So on the one hand, it's not going to give us complete clarity, but I want to read this to you because this influences how people think about Ezekiel 28. And here's the passage. So 1st Enoch 17, Enoch says, they lifted me up into one place where there were the ones like flaming fire. And when they so desire, they appear like men. So let's just stop there. Here in 1st Enoch 17, the first verse, you have a reference to beings who are like flaming fire. And that's going to be language drawn from the Old Testament. There are passages, and I'll give you the verse references here in a moment, where divine beings, members of the divine council, are described as fiery, okay, flames of fire, but they can also appear like men. Again, this fits the quote unquote angelic idea as well. So it fits the stones of fire actually being a reference to divine beings view pretty well. But that's not all there is to the passage. When we get into the next chapter, chapter 18, again, you kind of get a little bit of a different angle. So Enoch continues in chapter 18, verse 3 here. I saw how the winds ride the heights of heaven and stand between heaven and earth. These are the very pillars of heaven. I saw the winds which turn the heaven and cause the star to set, the sun as well as the stars. I saw the souls carried by the clouds. I saw the path of the angels and the ultimate end of the earth, and the firmament of the heaven above. And I kept moving in the direction of the west, and it was flaming day and night toward the 7 mountains of precious stones, 3 toward the east and 3 toward the south. Verse 10, and I saw what was inside those mountains, a place beyond the great earth where the heavens come together. And I saw a deep pit with heavenly fire on its pillars. I saw inside them descending pillars of fire that were immeasurable in respect to both altitude and depth. And on top of that pit, I saw a place without the heavenly firmament above it or earthly foundations under it or water. There was nothing on it, not even birds. It was a desolate and terrible place. And I saw there the 7 stars, which were like great burning mountains. Then the angel said to me, this place is the ultimate end of heaven and earth. It is the prison house for the stars and the powers of heaven. So we'll stop there. Now you see what you get there. You get references to mountains. Again, mountains are made of stone. Mountains that were burning. Okay, they are described again as this, sort of, flaming language. The flaming is the word that is used there in verse 6 of 1st Enoch 18. So the mountains are described as flaming. They're described as precious stones, which, of course, in Ezekiel 28 are these shining, luminous stones. So again, this shiningness, this light, brilliant appearance, kind of thing. But then when you get down to verse 13, we get the star language. I saw the 7 stars there. And you think, well, the stars, isn't that like the language that's used of divine beings, the sons of God in Job 38? It is, but look what Enoch does with it. I saw there the 7 stars, which were like great burning mountains. Oh, wait a minute. Again, if the stars here, what's going on here? The stars, mountains, flaming fire, mountains, and all this kind of stuff. What's going on? And then he actually turns it around in the very next verse and says that this place is the prison house for the stars, the powers of heaven, a very clear reference again to divine beings. So what Enoch does here is he actually kind of merges both options. that these flaming stones, flaming mountains, flaming stars, brilliant luminous stars, it's both a place and it's also, again, entities. So now people have looked at this passage and thought, well, sure, the book of Enoch is going to be at least a couple centuries later, 2 or 3 centuries later than Ezekiel. So we can't, really, it's poor method to assume that this was Ezekiel was thinking, but this is Second Temple Jewish literature. It's apocalyptic.
I find this really interesting. The connection he's making here. So he makes a connection that I don't necessarily make, but I want to. So notice what he says. He says he takes the accurate, being a scholar, obviously, despite popular belief to the fanboys out there who want to make Enoch part of the Bible. He almost does it, but he's not saying it's part of Scripture. I think he's said that before too, which I think is correct. I would have emphasized more that we shouldn't understand it as Scripture because, well, as I've pointed out, Enoch is written at a time when we would expect a sect to use it for their purposes in disagreeing with the Pharisees and whatnot that are running the temple according to the calendar. It seems that Jubilees and Enoch were used by these groups that went out away from the city and because they thought they were doing the calendar wrong. And so Jubilees has a prediction, which kind of fits with this in a weird way, if you think about it, because it's describing this image as sort of a destruction of Babylon sort of idea that's almost like an apostasy of God's people, which kind of comes over into the New Testament and out of Daniel. But it's interesting because it's like an interpretation of a pre-Christian idea that I would argue interprets an apostasy in the church from 2 Thessalonians 2. But Heiser's saying, look, yeah, I accept that, Ezekiel and Daniel are written contemporaneously in 600 BC or something along that effect. Enoch's made 300 years later in about 250 BC. And so he's commenting on how we should not let Ezekiel inform, obviously, our interpretation of Ezekiel, because it's obviously Ezekiel's older. But he's kind of nuancing the idea that, well, it can give us insights into closer to the time period, like how that was being interpreted. And so he's recognizing that and then explaining that rightly. Because a lot of people that want to say the book of Enoch should be part of the canon will pretend like it's written by Enoch. Well, we know that's not true. And so it doesn't negate its value as long as it's understood to be the resource that it is, understanding what it is and what it isn't, I would argue. But let's continue. He's almost done, and then I'll make the points I want to make where I see a connection with the actual canon text that's, let's say, God-breathed, I'll say. That is, without error and authentic in being part of what we consider Scripture, unlike Enoch, which is only greatly informative and valuable for other purposes other than being something that informs our understanding of theology, the plan of salvation, what God wanted in there to be a source of reproof and reproof.
Elliptic, it's not a direct connection back to Ezekiel 28, but it uses the language here that sort of sounds like Ezekiel 28. So maybe we should sort of read one into the other. Again, I'm a bit more cautious there. I think what we need to do is, instead of this passage, even though it's very interesting, and again, you could use part of it to argue either view, but even despite
interpretation here, because I want to show where I think it's because I agree with him on those things. But I want to say, well, what's this talking about? How does the New Testament connect to the Old Testament prophets? Okay, well, we know that Enoch seems to be an interpretation of messianic prophecies and an expectation of the coming Messiah, first Enoch. And so obviously it's getting a lot of its information from the book of Daniel. the Son of Man figure, is actually originally from Daniel, borrowed in Enoch, which helps give insights in the interpretation and thinking of the different people regarding their interpretation of Daniel, and I would argue the Old Testament prophets. So again, let's look at that Enoch passage. I want to focus on that for a second. This is what he was mentioning here when he mentions so this is the throne of sapphire. That's God's throne, by the way. You can deduce that from scripture, right? That's what the 10 commandments were cut out. Sapphire is blue stone, semi-transparent blue stone. Okay. So I'm going to argue that this imagery is depicting God's throne. So it's the judgment scene. Fire's issuing from heaven where God comes. You could say the firmament is pulled away. So that which sets the heavens and the earth apart has been taken away. It's kind of like this is the day of the Lord sort of imagery. He sees columns of fire falling. That seems to invoke some sort of judgment happening. But this is a vision. And so he saw the abyss. So I saw a deep abyss. And he's seeing fire come down out of heaven. From God's throne is in picture here, at least God's place of God's throne. Beyond the abyss, I saw a place which had no firmament of the heaven above. See, now here's no firmly founded earth. This is chaotic language. There was no more sea, that sort of language, right? Sea is imagery of the peoples. So there's no water upon it. Maybe the people are gone, no birds. Now that's what I want to focus in on, but it was a waste and horrible place. So we have this abyss, no water, no birds, and it's all broken down. This is very reminiscent of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and other things. So I saw 7 stars. Like he said, these stars are like the imagery of the fallen divine beings, right? Like maybe the council members. And it's likened to these burning mountains. And he's likening it to wormwood, which probably has a connection. And notice, and the angel said, this is the place of the end of the heavens and earth. People usually think of this as emphasizing a location, which it is, geography, but I think it's also just like Luke 16, people want to place that as a geography and a temporal sort of where people are when they're dead. And I think that's not wrong in a sense, but is what it's really also pointing to. I think it's saying this is the end of heaven and earth, can also kind of mean a particular time, the time of the judgment. The ends of the earth, it's picturing the geography of the whole earth in judgment, but it's at that time. And just like it speaks of, just like the language of being in Sheol, one person being in Abraham's bosom and the other being in a place of fiery torment. That's really looking down to the end of the world, where they're held in store for that end. That's what it's talking about. It's telling you about what you're facing. It's appointed once for man to die and then the judgment. It's using temporal, geographic location of the person, but really it's not talking about the nature of that place right now or their experience right now, but that they will experience something and a certain outcome awaits them at that time and place. This is not literal language. This is what they have in store. That's why it's describing 2 different places. In other words, God has two bags of people. People die and they're dead. They're not alive anymore. But they're not done. God's not done with it. Every person is going to face the judgment. Not because they're facing it right now, but because they're being described to warn others, right? It's like God has 2 bags. One is in a place for the baddies, and that's in the basement in a corner where it's kind of soggy and the light flickers. And they're in the bag. They don't know what's going on, but they're in that bag, and it's in that dark, bad, stingy, sort of grungy place, okay, where it's kind of wet and soggy. like a wet Muppet left in a puddle under some old dirty blankets with spiders crawling around, and the light flickers and buzzes the whole time. And then he's got another bag, and in that bag, it smells kind of nice, with perfume like mahogany and maybe scotch, and it sits next to his bed nightstand next to his picture of his favorite friend or whatever, and it's right within arm's reach, and it's perfect temperature, perfect humidity, and it's within arm's reach of God's nightstand. That's where the other bag is, and everybody goes into one of the bags. It's like, you could say that, and what would that mean? It would mean, some to everlasting life and some to judgment and everlasting contempt or whatever, and a destruction. That's the literal description, a future event. That's what's going on here. So these 7 stars, notice they're likened to being divine beings, let's say, like not divine beings, but supernatural realm beings that are principalities and powers sort of idea. But they're likened also to, like he said, like stones or these mountains. And then, what that reminds me of? It reminds me of, well, what do these people represent on the divine council? Well, they're the spiritual powers behind the nations that oppose God, as we see historically in the books of Daniel and history, etc. Right? And the struggle between God's agents and the agents of the rebellion. And so that seems right to me. But that, what the corollary to that is? Well, they are the spiritual beings representing, the people they control in the world. And it's the same thing in Daniel with the 4 kingdoms, right? There's kingdoms being talked about, and then there's the kings over those kingdoms. Of course, those are mentioned here too, right? These we saw in Ezekiel and Ezekiel and Isaiah, speaking of this time when Ezekiel 28 is not only describing Satan's expulsion out of heaven, a divine rebel from the primordial time, but then also Revelation 12 describes him as being cast down, like you could say, even more severely to the earth. He seems to be cast down in Job. I take that view, which Heiser may disagree with. I think the Satan in Job and Zechariah 3 indicate that that's actually literally Satan as he's understood through the New Testament lens. So he kind of takes an opposite use of the definite article with the Satan. And of course, the angel of the Lord was a Satan in the Hebrew language in Numbers 22 to Balaam, a false prophet, cursing God's people. And the angel of the Lord, or pre-incarnate Jesus, or Michael, if you will, which is why I would take that view, is a Satan to Balaam, the false prophet, right? So it definitely means and is used to say opposer. But when it's the Satan, I would say that's certainly talking about the divine being as mentioned in Ezekiel here, in view here. I'll go that far. But it's the same sort of reasoning as Heiser's doing. I just come to a different, which ones apply in that way. So I think in other words, I think the definite article actually indicates the individual rather than the other way around. Okay, so the what is he seeing here? Well, he's seeing the ends of the world, the final judgment on this rebellion, which I would argue manifests as prophesied and described in 2 Thessalonians 2, which is an interpretation of Daniel 7 being applied by Paul in the New Covenant period, and which is echoing what Jesus said, which is a parallel between the destruction of Jerusalem, which parallels the final judgment at the end of the world, and what the book of Revelation describes. Paul takes from Old Testament prophecy and applies it into the New Testament period, which has really interesting implications. But what is this? So these beings represent this geography or these mountains, but it's the same thing with Daniel and the kingdoms, which these beings represent as well. And this is why I tell people I kind of take a both and approach to Genesis 6. It's the mighty men on the earth that are opposing God, and angels that have been cast out of heaven. It's both and. It's those which oppose God and their real people in earth being influenced by real angelic beings, which is a real rebel group that were cast out of heaven. They're simultaneously, both is going on. You can't say it's one or the other. It doesn't really matter. It manifests into history. That's what the Bible presents. You can't detach it. It's really people opposing God's people and earth, real people, but there's more behind the scenes, which is what Daniel in the scriptures reveals. It's a divine rebellion that's playing out on our plane. And of course, history plays that out just as it was predicted. Because Israel was the people of God to bring the true creator back to the nations. And Israel kind of fails, but God has plans for that. And Jesus comes forth and he brings the knowledge of Yahweh to the world. And now the church is failing, even worse. And its fall was predicted in the same words that predict both God's love and disappointment with his people in Israel. And guess what? The church too. And so I think these beings, this is just an interpretation being developed out of Daniel, which is legitimate, but we can look at this through the lens of the book of Revelation now. And we saw the connection between the fall of Babylon and the fall of Lucifer and the lament against the prince of Tyre, which is really talking about that ultimate rebellion, right? That's where the principalities and powers, not against flesh and blood. But that doesn't mean there isn't flesh and blood opposition to righteousness in the world, right? And so I think this is applied. And these 7 stars are sort of the anti-spirits, antichrist spirit in a sense, right? Like we have the 7 churches, then we have an apostasy. So now I want to look at Revelation. Look at this. 7's all over the place, of course, but I just want to say, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. This is the apostasy language. The harlot woman is the woman riding the beast, mystery Babylon on her forehead. See how it's pulling in the fall of Babylon from the Old Testament, which is also talking about the divine rebel Satan, and then that imagery is pulled into this apostasy being described before this return of Jesus, and that apostasy is happening in the new covenant period according to 2 Thessalonians 2. In our last kingdom from Daniel, before the kingdom of Jesus fills the whole earth, is the 4th kingdom, which was the Roman kingdom. So is that being described in prophecy? Well, the answer is yes, although everybody has abandoned that view. 7 heads and 10 horns. So look, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup full of abominations, the filthiness of her fornication, and on her forehead was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. Drunk on the blood of the saints, the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled with a great amazement. Don't tell me this isn't the true interpretation, because this is coming from Daniel 7, which also has what Jesus pointed to as himself when this is a kind of a recapitulation of Daniel 7, which is where Jesus draws himself as the Son of Man as well, which is obviously what Enoch is pulling from, Daniel 7, the Son of Man figure, the messianic figure. It actually helps demonstrate that they did interpret this messianic figure, and Jesus teaches him that that's him before the Pharisees. And yeah, I am the Son of Man. Yes, you'll see me coming on the clouds of heaven, on the right hand of power. I'm that guy. And they knew what that meant. We see the New Testament writers using language from Enoch. Everybody knew about it. And which was an echo of Daniel. Now the authentic is here in the New Testament, the manifestation of the true interpretation of Daniel 7. Enoch just helps us inform us on how they understood Daniel 7. And it's realizing, so put away Enoch and learn from Revelation first, not the other way around. Okay? That's how it should inform us. It should be secondary. You guys are like making your Ellen White books more important than the Bible. Only your Ellen White book is the book of Enoch. So let's see. who is Mystery Babylon, right? The woman, where does she sit? On 7 mountains. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And there's also 7 kings. This is coming from Daniel. This is where the city is. It's Mystery Babylon. It's apostate Jerusalem. It's Mystery Babylon. It's like apostate. It's the apostate people of God. It's the rebels against God. It's the beast that was not and is not, is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. That's the son of perdition. That's the manifestation of the kingdoms that comes out of the 10 horns, which you saw are 10 kings. This is the Roman Empire manifested into a church-state system when the land and sea beasts come back together and the deadly head wound is healed. And the kings with the beast, these are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast, the Roman beast, the 4th beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of... So anyways, the waters which you saw, remember there was this language of no waters. I wanted to point out this too. From Enoch, where it's getting that imagery, I'm almost certain here. You can see the same language. It's in several places, and the New Testament uses some of this imagery, but we have, let's see. Maybe I'll continue this later, but get some more stuff together. But look at this. We have the promises in Isaiah 14. Notice this organization here. The Lord will have mercy on Jacob and will choose Israel. So he's like, his promises to Israel. Again, this is not national Israel. This is God's people. It's just the way the New Testament uses this Isaiah 14 passage. It's intimately tied with the, see, this is where people get off here. It's like, it's already, but not yet. Jesus inaugurates it and sets up the thing that brings in the nations, but he set it up with Israel. The remnant of Israel did believe in the 1st century. And so in that way, preterism is true as it applies to Israel. He established his thing with his people. The church is Israel but it's like people need to get back to the roots of the church, which is their church. We're grafted in, not the other way around. We got grafted into them 2,000 years ago. And then we kind of stole it from them. And now people say that's replacement theology. And then they separate the scriptures. And it's like, no, all backwards. The promises to Israel have come. It's their church. They established it. Remember the Sabbath. Hand the church back to them. It's a Jewish church. Not because we have to do everything they did or go back to Mosaic covenant precisely or something. But I'm saying it's their church. We're grafted in. Or did you forget? It's not, oh, the promises to Israel haven't come yet. They're going to believe, and then that totally flips prophecy upside down and the interpretation all upside down, because it's like, oh, are you going to deny that God made Israel? No, you're denying God established his promises with Israel 2,000 years ago. And then you stole the church from Israel. Now you're saying I'm the replacement theology. No, you're the replacement theology. You are. That message that they received and established the church in, that was all Jews. The 7 churches were established by all first covenant people who kept the Sabbath. It's their church. You stole it. Now you're trying to flip the script. So, what's my point? Well, people flip this upside down. It's like, look, he established the church, but it's already, but not yet. And now the nations are still trying to figure it out. And so first, sorry, I get sidetracked with that. So Isaiah 14, so that's what's going on here. And then it talks about the fall of Babylon. And that's how Revelation shows this. It's the same thing here in Jeremiah 4, leading up to the Eschaton, leading up to the millennial period. There's a period where people are gone and the earth is broken down. The nations bless themselves in it. But see, it's intermixed with, some of this is fulfilled in Jesus inaugurating it, but it also points to the end of the world. It's just like when Jesus reads in from Isaiah and when he starts his ministry, he leaves out that last little part about the day of the Lord, taking vengeance, the day of vengeance of our God. He didn't read that part. It's right in the middle of the text, right? Isaiah 61, which tells you like this is going to be split into 2 pieces. But sometimes these texts don't, describe it. So it's like, well, this sounds like something that hasn't happened yet. Well, kind of. But the salvation has come for Israel and all the nations, and it's in Jesus. It's already, but not yet fully realized. The kingdom isn't fully realized, but it's inaugurated. This is the past event. This is what God has done for Israel. And many of them did believe and have believed over the centuries. They're not missing out on anything because of that interpretation. Don't deny what's established by Christ when he came to his people and brought the new covenant, and many did believe. It's not forgetting the Jews. You should be saying, you shouldn't be telling them that there's going to be a national turning. They've been in the land. People have lived and died, never believed in Jesus. Are they going to get a second chance? Everybody's been getting a chance. It's their church. Not like, well, they haven't turned yet. Yes, they did. They established the church. You filthy animal. You've got it totally upside down, and then you try to shame people. Well, I'm not Catholic. I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm not a Gentile that thinks the church is something different than the original church. I'm not the one robbing it. You're the one saying the church is Gentile. No, the church is Jewish. But for all people. But I'm saying, like, they established it. It's theirs first. Everyone's had a chance to enter there. Those of Israel that aren't of Israel have always had a chance to enter the church. And the more you make it Gentile and say it's not theirs, the harder it's going to be for them to come into it. So it's your fault that people don't come into the Christian faith that are Jewish. If you want Jewish people to be saved, let's make the church Jewish again then. Or show its Jewish roots like it of what it actually is and was, or supposed to be, or whatever. I'm not trying to say every other church is like worthless or not, people aren't saved in it. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, if you're worried about the Jews coming in, they've always been able to come in. It's their church. And so that's been established, but not fully realized. But no, so these promises shouldn't be read like, well, this has to be for Israel in the future. No, it doesn't. It's already inaugurated. That's their thing. So this language is the same thing. Let's see. Jeremiah 4. This is what I want to focus in on. What I think Ezekiel, Enoch's getting it from. And this obviously has application to when it was written to the original audience, but it also has correlation with like final judgment and the day of the Lord imagery. So you just got to remember that. I'm not ignoring that context, okay? But it's mysterious in that way. It has application. Like there's a past event for some of these prophecies, but see. It uses that same language we see in other clearly. Behold, he shall come up like clouds, and his chariots like a whirlwind. His horses are swifter than you're plundered. Wash your heart from wickedness that you may be saved. Let's see. I'm looking for a particular part here. That watchers come from a far country, raise their voices against Judah, like keepers of a field are against her all around, because she has been rebellious against me. Your ways and your doings. I cannot hold my peace, because you have heard, O my soul, the sound of the trumpet. The alarm of war, destruction upon destruction is cried, for the whole land is plundered. Suddenly my tents are plundered. Hear the sound of a trumpet? Oh, for my people are foolish. Let's see. They do evil. This is like the Christian church too, all wrapped up in this, calling evil good and good evil. But to do good, they have no knowledge. I beheld the earth, and indeed it was without form and void. That's the part I want to look at real quick. So what's this a vision of here? The heavens, they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and indeed they trembled, and all the hills moved back and forth, and there was no man, and all the birds had fled. Okay. Now let's look at this again. And beyond these mountains is the region of the end of the great earth. This is the final judgment. This is the day of the Lord. And I saw a deep abyss, columns of fire falling, judgment falling. There was no earth beneath it. There was no water upon it and no birds, but it was a waste and horrible place, an abyss. If you look in, let's see. If you look up in the Septuagint, this tohu vabohu right here is the same language also referred to in Genesis prior to the recreation. That language. So some people try to think this is a vision of the past, like a old earth sort of weird thing. No, it's a vision of a this is the same imagery of the wilderness. The earth is left as a waste, a wilderness. Hence the Day of Atonement, the scapegoat being sent into the wilderness. This is where Satan is left. When it talks about him being sent down to Sheol, it's actually looking to Satan being cast into the wilderness, blamed for the rebellion, chained to the earth for 1,000 years into the abyss. The abyss is the earth put back into its what's described in Genesis prior to the creation, when it was without form and void. The pre-ordering of the earth in creation. Why is that even there? Why is it in the Genesis account? What's the point of adding that detail? Why doesn't it just say God made the earth and it was for a purpose without? And people say, well, it says he made it without form and void. No, it's saying it describes the earth before God started, and that's why that's one of the reasons. Like, people have this idea where, like, with like what's his name, John, the famous Genesis scholar John Walton, right? This is one of the reasons he formulates his argument about the theological imagery of the temple imagery, right? In Genesis. Let me just tell you right now, it's both. It's telling you the story of a 7-day creation, and there's all sorts of interesting theological Easter eggs in there. Why is day 2 and God saw that it was good missing? Why is that missing? Every day has that refrain, God saw that it was good except for day 2. Why do the things God does on day 2 and prior to that in the Psalm 104, which is a creation psalm because it goes through the order of the days of creation, describing that? And old earthers love that view because it's describing the creation account, and it is describing the creation account, young earthers, by the way, Psalm 104 or 102, whichever one it is. It seems to be describing the flood and the creation story, and during the period of day 2 is when it describes the flood language. And so old earthers say, no, it can't be a worldwide flood. God set the boundaries of the sea and they will not pass. And it's talking about creation. Therefore, there can't be a worldwide flood. Ha, 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 ha. And young earthers are like, no, look at this language. This psalm clearly reflects the same exact language as the flood account in Genesis 6. It's talking about the flood. And I looked into this and I was like, you know what? I'm going to listen to what the old earthers have to say. And I watched this old earth guy and he meticulously went through the creation account, and I made notes. Okay, no evening and morning on day 7. Interesting. No, God saw that it was good on day 2. What's with this psalm? Is it a flood psalm? Honest inquirers who study it will say, yeah, this really sounds like it's using the same language as the flood, what happened in the flood. Like when it talks about the flood, that seems to be describing a worldwide flood, like in precision. Like, it's just like when people say that it's not describing a worldwide flood, and all the excuses they give, including the dear Dr. Heiser trying to throw a bone to old earthers, which I respect that he's sticking up for them, but it's like, it's clearly saying, I don't care what people say. It's so obvious. It's like, dude, it's trying to tell you that world that God created. I don't care if Moses knew about it. It's describing that the world that God created, everything died in it that he made. The whole thing. Every mountain, under the whole heaven, everything that breathed through the nostrils died, except for the things on the ark. And it covered above the highest hills, under the whole heaven. It's like, dude, just shut up. You're better off saying it's not true in that way. It's just being hyperbolic, but it's describing an utter destruction, because the New Testament uses it that way to describe the judgment of the earth and fire by Jesus, which is the whole earth as we understand it. So, but okay, whatever, I get it. So what's going on here? The honest inquiry was that this is using flood language, and it's certainly using a flood motif, a creation motif. Why? Well, it's both. That's why. Because day 2 is describing the period in history, according to the biblical narrative, the period during the flood. And that's correlates with day 2, because the waters above are separated from the waters below on day 2. And that's exactly what's described in the flood account, coming back together. The thing that God did to order the world came unordered, and it grieved in his heart that he had to destroy man. It grieved him that he made man, because he had to take him out. And so he undid the creation that he did on day 2 during the second millennium, you could say, or during that period of God's, what that was theologically sort of predicting the flood. That's why it doesn't say God saw that it was good on day 2. That's why it's missing from day 2, because day 2 is describing the reversal of what God did on that creative day. That is, separated the waters above from the waters below. And then he opened the windows of heaven and the fountains of the great deep burst forward. So that psalm is a clue that tells you it is talking about the floods, that he will not let the seas go past their boundaries again and ever to be a flood like that ever again. He promised. It's the rainbow promise. So it is talking about the flood in a pattern of the creation narrative, because the day 2 of the creation narrative is describing the major event that demonstrates God by the things which were made, Romans 1. Paul's thinking of the creation account and how it foretold, like, the things of God, God's particular attributes as God are clearly seen by the things which are made. Where does it say what God made? Yes, it's true. You can look at the creation and go, wow, God created the trees. Wow, look at the trees. And I believe it. The trees, I love trees. I love Acer palmatums. I'm a tree guy, a nerd. I look at the trees and I say, yep, there's a God. So I resonate with that idea. But okay, Paul's like saying, Paul knows the text. Paul knows Genesis. When Peter's talking about God being long suffering in the days of Noah, and he talks about the flood narrative, he's reciting the Torah in his head. He's steeped in the text. Paul's steeped in the text. So when he says the things that are made, he's going, God's attributes are seen from heaven by the things which are made. He's thinking about the days of creation and the things God made on each separate day, and how that predicts major events recorded in the biblical historical narrative about the major events of God's interventions. Day 2 was the flood. And it demonstrates God as the judge. Day 1 demonstrates God as the creator. When he separates light and dark, right? I mean, you could postulate in all sorts of ways. Day 3 is like God is the redeemer, you could say, on some level, right? Because he takes them through dry land, makes dry land appear, he separates the waters from the waters, and that's, of course, the major event. And the next millennium, the next period that's being described by the things God made on that particular day correlates with the Exodus, when he made dry land appear and they took them through the dry land, through the ocean. And then the grass grows up, the tender shoots grow up on the dry land, which is like describing him calling his people, making covenant with them. And that's why Jesus is the harvester, timing the wild grass that's freshly sprouted when God took them into the wilderness and gave him his covenant. That's the grass sprouting up, the freshly sprouted grass, calling the people back through Moses, and he took them through the sea. So all these things have correlation. And so the millennium has the same thing, and it's with the earth being a wilderness, where the goat for Azazel, who's the demon in the wilderness, where he's cast into that wilderness, which is all over the Bible in its descriptions. That's Satan being chained for 1,000 years during the millennium. And there was no man, because all the wicked who worship the beast are killed when Jesus returns and the earth is broken down. Satan is chained to the earth because that's the casting away of at the beginning of the end of sin. All these kings that are going to find themselves, cast to the ground with all these kings, they're going to look at the devil, because they're going to be resurrected, and then they're all going to face their final judgment after the 1,000 years, when God comes back with his people and then Jerusalem coming down out of heaven to restore the earth. In fact, destroy what earth? The tohu vavohu earth that was broken down at the coming of the Lord, when he killed the Antichrist that was persecuting his bride, who he takes to heaven temporarily, while Satan is chained to the earth, which is a broken down wilderness with no humans on it, just him and his fallen angels in the wilderness, cast away in the mess they've made. And that's what's described in Revelation 20. And so this is a vision, and that is a tohu vavohu earth
which will be the condition of the earth once again, right before the recreation and the restoration of heaven and earth coming together forever. And so this is a vision of a desolated earth in a broken down condition, which will be the pre-recreation form of the earth, a big chiasm, just like the whole Bible is describing in its function and form. And so that's what he's seeing here. And that's what Enoch is seeing. He's looking down at the end of time. He's seeing the 7 hills on fire, which are the 7 hills of Mystery Babylon and Babylon's destruction. And those princes who are behind those kings of the earth that sit on many waters. Mystery Babylon the Great, the woman riding the beast. The woman is the harlot apostasy riding the 4th beast, which is Rome, who sits over the kings of the earth and the peoples of the earth. And Enoch is describing that imagery when he's looking down at the end of time, at the ends of time and space, at the great judgment of Babylon, Mystery Babylon, which is 7 mountains, sits on 7 hills, and those beings which are behind it, with the kings of the earth that are cast down to the pit until he brings them forth after the 1,000 years. And that's the Gog and Magog sort of imagery where God, that's the lake of fire. Because Jesus raises all of the lost people that have been dead and Satan's left on the earth by himself in the wilderness. And when Jesus comes back with the saints, Jesus raises all the people that were dead in history because they're either stayed dead when he came at the beginning, took the bride, left Satan chained to the earth. That's the imagery it was pointing to. And it's all wrapped up in the Day of Atonement, properly understood in its typological form. Scapegoat is Satan banished to the wilderness. And then all those who aren't saved are raised at the end of the 1,000 years. And that's Satan being released from his prison. And that's the imagery being described, because it's the kings of the earth that oppose God. They'll all be there and they'll say, this is the man who made the nations tremble, et cetera, et cetera. And that's when they're all judged finally in the lake of fire. They face their judgment. They try to attack the city come down out of heaven, which is Jesus and the saints coming back to bring heaven and earth together. And the final execution is against the wicked is judged. So the earth is made in, it's almost like the earth gets its millennial rest. There's no kingdom on the earth during the millennial period. There's no getting saved after Jesus returns. His reward is with him to give to everybody. Everyone who's on the earth at that time, they have the mark of God or they have the mark of the beast. All those who have the mark of the beast die. They're killed. The angels are sent forth. That's the first thing that happens in Matthew 24. The one's taken, one left. The one taken is taken in judgment, because he's just said, like the days of Noah, they were eating and drinking, then the flood came and swept them all away. One standing at the mill, one taken, one left. The one taken is taken in judgment. They're wiped away like the flood. That's Jesus sending out his angels. And at that same time, then he also resurrects the dead. And yes, there is a taking to heaven temporarily. They meet the Lord in the clouds in the air to meet the Lord. They're raised from the dead, and they meet the Lord in the air in the clouds. That's what it says. Because he takes them to the Father's house, to the marriage supper of the Lamb, in his Father's house, where there's many rooms, where Jesus has been this whole time, and he promised he'd come back to get us, so that where he is, we will be also. It's the marriage supper of the Lamb. It's in heaven, but it's not the permanent place. And you don't go there when you're dead. You go there alive when Jesus takes you there and destroys his enemies and makes the earth a desolate place where there's no man and no birds. All the birds had fled. And Satan is in the wilderness and stuck on a desolate earth for 1,000 years. That's him being chained for 1,000 years. There's no kingdom on the earth. That comes down out of heaven after the 1,000 years. And when Jesus comes back with the saints in the city and heaven and earth come together, I know it's really literal, but that's what it's describing. Jesus is somewhere. And when Jesus comes back with the saints, he raises all the wicked dead into mortal bodies, because they don't receive eternal life, but they're raised up for judgment in mortal bodies. Now Satan, who's been stuck on the earth, chained for 1,000 years, quote unquote, released. And he has, these are where he gets the people to try to, attack the holy city coming down out of heaven, and they surround it, and fire comes down out of heaven and devours them. That's the lake of fire. That's where the wicked come from, even though Christ has already come and separated the sheep and the goats. The first thing that happens is the wicked that are worshiping the beast are all killed, and all the rest of the dead people who didn't live, who have lived and died in the past, are just remain dead. All the wicked, it says all of those on the earth will worship the beast except for the people written in the book of life. So when Jesus comes, he destroys the Antichrist power and the wicked that are worshiping the beast, because if you've worshiped the beast, you will be thrown into the lake of fire. So you're lost. That's what that means. And everybody else that's alive, that's faithful, will be gathered with those who are resurrected. And who will be resurrected? Well, every person that's righteous or saved or whatever, redeemed. That's everybody. Everybody else would be not saved. And it says he separates them at his coming. So so all the wicked are just dead. They're not alive. And everyone that's redeemed is saved when Jesus comes. And Satan's chained to the earth because there's no one there. The saints are taken to the marriage supper of the Lamb, and all the wicked are dead until the end of the 1,000 years. That's what the Gog and Magog is. Because when Jesus returns with the saints, Jesus is the power to resurrect people. Jesus raises the quick and the dead. That's what releases Satan, and that's what gives him people to surround the holy city that it describes in the Gog and Magog imagery described in Revelation 20, which ends up being them trying to attack God and being destroyed in the lake of fire that comes down out of heaven, according to the Old Testament prophets, and whose imagery is used in that scene in Revelation 20 and 21. Anyway, so that's what's being described. Enoch is describing, whether authentic or not, it's describing that judgment of Babylon the Great, according to the book of Revelation, which the imagery is correct, that the stars are those principalities and powers behind those evil nations and those kings, which can represent mountains or actual beings. So what's the fiery stones, perhaps, that Ezekiel's speaking of in Ezekiel 28, that God's going to just, destroy or remove you from the fiery stones? Well, if it's Satan behind that, and the fiery stones represent the Antichrist power, which is the false prophet, Heiser goes on to describe, well, you can see this as sort of like a separating this rebel from these fiery stones. Well, he is. And how? By destroying the human powers that he's influencing in the earth, because the Antichrist is destroyed. And it says Satan is destroyed where the beast and the false prophet are. That is where on the surface of the earth, at Christ's first coming, where the beast and the false prophet were, in 2 Thessalonians 2, who Christ destroys with the brightness of his coming and the breath of his mouth. That's speaking of the earthly power, essentially, from Daniel 7, which is intimately tied to this whole thing in the New Testament and Enoch and the Eschaton in Paul's work and John. And Jesus' teaching. When he spoke and referred to the desolation, the abomination that causes desolation, or the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And then Paul speaks of that more and refers to that, 2 Thessalonians 2, as the great apostasy in the New Covenant period, which obviously reaches down to the second coming, which even Daniel touches, right? Because that person from Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, I would argue, is being described as the king of the north in Daniel 11. And Daniel 11, describing that prince, goes into Daniel 12, and it says, at that time, after describing all the things that end with the prince of the north, who has the attributes of the one from Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, that little horn, the man of sin, speaks blasphemies against the Most High, seeks to be over all the gods and God and the so-called gods, and comes by the power of the workings of Satan and speaks blasphemies against the Most High, and seeks to change God's times and laws, and is that power which comes out of the fourth beast, which is Rome. And the woman in the book of Revelation is the woman riding the beast, which is the fourth beast in Revelation 13. And that person is Mystery Babylon that sits on 7 hills, which is the woman riding Rome, which is a harlot people of God. So it's an apostasy in the church, which is it's being described by Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2. And she has the spirit of the Antichrist, which distorts the connection of Jesus with the Father and their unity by saying Jesus didn't come in the flesh, and he's saving us from the Old Testament mean God. So he doesn't come bearing the same love or law of the Father or word of the Father, but Jesus said, I do. It's those who don't recognize me because of my intimacy and unity with the Father, because you don't know the Father. But when one comes in his own name, you will recognize him because he's like you. And he seeks the honor from men and not from the only true God, like I do. I come in the name of the Father. Me and my Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Anything that distorts that relationship between Jesus and the Father is Antichrist. And that spirit behind that apostate spirit that is a counterfeit and is the son of perdition, that is like Judas, he sold out to Rome. He sold Jesus out to Rome. That city is Babylon the whore, the great city, the mother of harlots, that sits on many waters, that sits on the 7 hills. And behind those kings are principalities and powers. And the burning of those 7 mountains, I'm going to argue, is the destruction of Babylon the Great, manifested at the end of time in the judgments of God. That's what he saw. He saw the earth being turned into a waste and the destruction of Babylon from the throne of God, and it being cast down into the abyss, into Sheol, which is an event and that sends that to the underworld. That's the beginning of the end of evil. That's what it's. So maybe the fiery stones is actually a future event, because Ezekiel 28 is speaking of a future event at the destruction of Satan in hell, because never shall you be any more forever. You'll be ashes under their feet. They'll be astonished at you, and never shall you be any more forever. You original divine character that defied me, who's the last enemy, and is represented by the sins being cast to you, the originator of the rebellion, by the great high priest who's removed the sins of the people, and they cast it on you into the wilderness until you're utterly destroyed by the return of Jesus and his saints in the city. When heaven and earth come together and the whole creation is restored and God is all in all, and there's no more sin, no more death, no more suffering, no amazing la la land, metaphysical la la land where God tortures the little gods who are immortal in their souls, so they got to live somewhere forever. No, that's all pagan garbage, accretions into the church that distort the character of God and deny that God will restore all things in his creation, which is the utter removal and destruction of sin, sinners, the beginning of the rebellion, and any hopes of the rebellion ever rearing its ugly head ever again. And it's all foretold in the Bible. And it's all there if you let the Bible teach you, if you understand that God alone is immortal and the gift of life is a gift. But if you refuse to see that, you'll never understand it and never understand what it's saying and the promises of God and the plan of God. Not that I'm saying I have it all right, but, oh, that can't be right because I go to heaven when I die. So that can't be right. And hell is an eternal conscious torment where God never keeps his promises. I'm sorry, I don't have any more patience for that. It's trash. It's not true. It distorts the truth. It distorts the character of God. It puts the focus in the wrong place. And it causes you to not have a chance at understanding eschatology and the promises of God as they're described in all this stuff. And I'm not saying I got everything right, but I'm saying that those are key features that I see why everyone disagrees and why they can't agree, because of those sorts of things. Dead people are actually just dead. And that's why there's a resurrection. And you can't possibly make sense of the imagery if you don't realize that. You can't possibly understand it if you don't get Daniel's 70th week right. You can't possibly, how can somebody truly understand where God's coming from if everybody's telling them that God's going to torture you forever because you're immortal and you're going to live somewhere forever? What if people aren't totally, utterly depraved? And so the fact that you try to tell them that Jesus wants to save them, but then out of the other side of your mouth, you're like, well, God is going to torture you if you don't do it forever. And people aren't actually totally depraved, utterly depraved, and they actually have reasoning capability. And you telling them that makes it impossible for them to possibly understand the way God feels about them or what God wants to do for them. Because that just doesn't compute. What if that version of the gospel actually is hindering somebody from being saved? I think it does. I think it does. I think it's an improper understanding of God. And some people, depending on their circumstances and life experiences, shouldn't love God if that's true. Because it wouldn't be authentic.